Hi and welcome back. Today I'd love you to join me and to paint along with this beautiful scene from somewhere on the North Cornish coast near Polzeath, a favourite spot of mine to go on holiday. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper. It's taped to my board and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees. This way, as I paint wet in wet, the paint flows gently down the page and diffuses and can give me some lovely effects. This painting is suitable for beginners. It's nice and easy. And I'm starting off by wetting my sky area. I've just lightly sketched in a very simple outline of my beach with my horizon line and just penciled in a light area where I'm going to have a few figures on the beach. I'm using here Davidson's Pigments Sky Blue. Follow the link below if you're interested in our new range of watercolour paint. You can use cerulean blue instead. It's an ideal alternative. I'm using horizontal brush strokes with my small Pro Art Ron Ranson Harky brush, and you can see it's giving me this lovely lightly graduated wash. I will strengthen it up a little bit more with a bit of paint across the top. And as I paint this sky wash wet in wet, I'm looking for a fairly even wash. I'm happy for it to be slightly graduated, probably a little bit darker across the top and lighter towards the horizon line. As the water beads up along the horizon line, I can just use a clean damp brush to mop it up and then lay my board flat once the wash is looking nice, and then I can bring a little bit of stronger colour across from the right with the tips of my brush to bring in some water and waves just gently into the beach and the sort of rocky area which I shall paint shortly. With this first wash, I'm not differentiating between the sea and the sky. I'm just getting a nice smooth transition from one to the other. Once this is all dry and I've painted in the beach, then I will paint over the sky, the sea with a slightly darker colour. But for now, this is raw sienna and I'm painting in the sand and the stones and the seaweed, the rocks, the barnacles, everything like that. I'm beginning with raw sienna and it's a very rich colour. I can pull a bit of that out in the distance and to get some variation into this, but I'm looking for a reasonably good covering of fairly creamy paint because I'm going to be using the corner of a plastic card to etch through the paint and to create my rocks. It's a nice simple way for beginners to create beautiful rock shapes and textures without having to sort of struggle with painting too much detail. But for it, I do need reasonably strong paint. So now I'm adding some darker paint into the raw sienna, and that's our Davidson's Grey, and you can use Payne's Grey for that, and burnt umber, burnt sienna. First I applied it quite smoothly with a 3/4 inch flat brush with horizontal sweeps, and now I'm going back to my Harky brush and just sort of dabbing with the tips to create texture on the paint that I've got on the page. And now I've got enough paint there, I can take a piece of plastic store card that I have cut into a narrow strip, and using the rounded corner I'm pulling it horizontally through the paint, larger in the foreground, smaller as I get further back towards the mid-ground, although I will put in some really large rocks in the mid-ground later, but I'm focusing on these smaller shapes at the moment. As I pull through the paint with the corner of the rigid plastic card, it moves the paint and I'm left with a paler mark with a dark mark around it. I can then go back in and put some shadows around the rocks that I'm creating, and it will give me a really interesting and simple effect I get my beach effect sort of very, very quickly happening on the page using this method. If you're a beginner, it's worth practicing this with some rich paint on a scrap of spare paper first, so that you understand how the technique works. And now I'm going to put in those larger rocks in the background, the kind of big rocks that children just love to clamber over. And then we've got our smaller, more detailed rocks in the foreground. And again, now that we've pulled the paint away to reveal the pale paper underneath, we just need to put a few shadows underneath using fairly dark paint. And now I can carefully just flick a few little drops of clean water over the rocky area to add even more texture and sort of diffusion and interest. So this layer is nearly finished. You can work backwards and forwards quickly, adding in a few more rocks if you choose, a few more shadows, and then using the tips of the flat brush you can get a little bit of shadow and definition into the water, but without overdoing it. You just want a few touches here and there in the foreground, because the foreground is closer to us, therefore as a viewer we see more detail, and then we see less detail as we go back into the distance. The figures will be the focal point here, so all I'm doing really at the moment is setting the scene. And I can add a bit of that beautiful sky blue or cerulean blue if you don't have sky blue, just into the rock pools, and that just continues the theme of the beautiful blue sky and the blue sea that's such an idyllic part of this lovely Cornish landscape. And now's the time to walk away from it and let it dry completely, then we'll come back and finish the painting. It's now completely dry, and I've stuck a piece of masking tape across the horizon so that I can get a nice flat sea. Your painting must be totally dry, and please do check that masking tape doesn't tear your paper. Some cheaper papers will tear with masking tape, so check first before you paint. What I'm going to do now is mix up my sky blue or cerulean blue, if you don't have sky blue, with a bit of the raw sienna until I get a sort of greenish tinge to it. And then using my Pro Art Harky brush, dragging it along over the tape and in horizontal lines, hitting and missing so that I leave some of that pale blue showing through, which will give me the illusion of waves breaking and coming in the distance. So it's really important to leave those gaps. If you lose those gaps, though, you could always go back once it was dry and add a bit of white gouache if you need to. And while the paint's still wet, I'm just picking up a sort of greyish mixture from all the colours on my palette and just dropping a bit of dark in here and there, which would diffuse into that greeny blue water. Just give me a little bit of variety and value there. So I think that's dark enough across my horizon now. So I'm going to carefully peel off the tape. If you think it might tear if it sticks, then warm it up with a hairdryer first as you peel it off, and that loosens the tack or the glue on the masking tape. Now that's a lot better, and because we use the same colour as the sky, it's a nice sort of harmonious greeny blue. Now it's time to let it dry completely, and we'll come back and put in our figures on the beach. Now the style of figures that I paint in landscapes is usually quite subdued, very loose with hardly any detail, often silhouetted or backlit against the sun. But I'm going to try and add a little bit of colour this time, but I'm still going to start off with my small calligraphy brush and just get in a very loose impression of two people on the beach, and then a bit later on I'll put a child in, but I'm going to get the couple in first. And so I'm painting them sort of like an elongated carrot, sort of wider at the top and narrowing down with a sort of a dot for the head and a few lumps and bumps just to imply an arm here or a leg there. Nothing really detailed, and I'm using a dark colour to start with. I'm going to link the figures because then there's a kind of a linkage between the couple. They're standing close to each other, chatting, walking along the beach, and somehow that sort of turning the figures or joining them in a sort of a blob but with a few details is really effective, and our brains interpret that as two people standing next to each other. So now that I'm happy with the shape, I'm dabbing carefully to remove some of the colour with a tissue, really carefully because I don't want to smudge them. And now that I've removed most of that dark, I can go over the areas again faintly with a little bit of colour. So I'm just introducing a bit of colour here and there in the figures to sort of imply sort of colourful clothing. So like sort of coats and trousers, that sort of thing. And then putting in some shadow underneath them and around them sort of beds them into the landscape. You could carry on with the calligraphy brush for this, but I like the tips of a flat brush. And what I'm trying to do is to get them to look as if they're standing on some of those larger rocks in the midground. And while the figures are drying, use the flat brush and some pale grey to put in a very small headland in the distance in pale paint, because that will give you aerial perspective and depth and distance to your painting. The flat brush is really good for this because you can keep it nice and flat and nice and straight along the horizon. And lastly, a few finishing touches. I'm going to add some blue into the trousers of the smaller figure on the right. And I think having the red and the blue really works well to make these figures stand out. And then I'm going to go back in and keep working on balancing up my last few darks in the shadows underneath the couple and then across the beach wherever I think it might need just a few small touches in the foreground, just to make it pop a little bit more. And then last of all, now that I'm happy with my couple, I'm going to add a child. And the child is going to be placed on the right, and it's going to be slightly smaller but still linked to the couple by the joining of a hand and sort of leaning slightly away from the couple, looking into a rock pool or something like that, keeping the child a little bit smaller but sort of in proportion with the couple. And I think it makes for a really nice little very loose, very simple figure group that's certainly suitable for beginners. So I think I'm going to call that finished. Well, I hope you liked that painting, and as I say, I think it's quite beginner friendly. There's a few techniques that you need to practice in your sketchbook, like the sort of scraping out of the rocks and those sorts of techniques, but other than that, it's just a few very simple stages put together with making sure that you leave things to dry between the stages. Okay, so removing the tape, and now we can see everything with the clean white border. Then I think I'm really pleased with this. It's nice and fresh. The sky blue is a beautiful colour. Please follow the link below to our Etsy shop if you're interested in purchasing some sky blue. But if not, you can use cerulean blue, which is the perfect choice for these sorts of beautiful summer beach seascapes. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and click on the bell icon, and That means that you'll be notified whenever I list a new video. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon. And happy painting. Bye.